During 1973 to 1974, it was a mess in America, circulating with government issues regarding the infamous scandal Watergate, which would shape the nation and government as we know it today. To know about the scandal, we would have to go back to the election of 1968. Richard Nixon, a Republican candidate, won the election of 1968 against his opponents Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace, becoming the 37th President of the United States. Nixon was a man of character, being a knowledgeable politician and skilled diplomat. He was experienced and ambitious to becoming the president. On the other hand, he had his flaws, being that he would get paranoid and controlling over government officials, and he was an egotistical man. Nixon became popular because he attracted the American people with his plans to end the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a very controversial topic at the time, since the United States was losing against the North Vietnamese. Before World War II, Vietnam was ruled by the French. However, after the war, Vietnam managed to gain its own independence. France would attempt to gain its imperial control of Vietnam back again, but fails. The people of Vietnam, especially the Northerners, wanted Vietnam's own independence, being ruled by Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist leader. The United States would get involved with the war because the Americans did not want another country to fall to communism, especially in Asia, since countries were predominated with communist governments. The Americans spent billions of dollars and deployed millions of soldiers into Vietnam, but the U.S. was still losing the war. The war was a very controversial topic at the time, since there were mixed views whether if the U.S. should continue the war for the sake of democracy or end the war for the sake of American soldiers. So Nixon's plan to end the war as quickly as possible was by peace with honor. The plan was to slowly take out the American troops in Vietnam and let the South Vietnamese fight their own battle. This plan attracted the attention of many because it appealed to both parties, being that America will still leave Vietnam in peace. A man named Daniel Ellsberg, an American government official working with the Defense Department, would leak secret, confidential government information about the Vietnam War in 1971. The information would be classified as the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers proved that the government was lying to the people about the war because they stated that the U.S. was winning. However, these statements contradicted with what the papers stated. Ellsberg was surprised and angry, feeling the need to tell the people by leaking the papers. Once the public reached the papers, they were starstruck and angry how the government was lying to their faces. The people blamed Nixon since he was the president at the time, even though the war's damages were caused by his predecessors, Harry S. Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon B. Johnson. Nixon was paranoid how the American people blamed him even when he had tried to stop the war the entire time. Nixon approached the situation to either play offensive or defensive. Nixon can either downplay the incident suggested by Ehrlichman and Haldeman, or have a tough response suggested by Colson and Krogh. Nixon, the stubborn man he is, wanted to appear forceful, so he agrees with Colson and Krogh. Hence, the Plummer Party is assembled. They would recruit several people such as G. Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt. The Plumbers Party goal was to discredit Ellsberg's personality and make him seem as a crook. They would undergo many illegal operations as known as Operation Gemstone. In 1971, the Plumbers would go into Ellsberg's psychiatrist office, Dr. Lewis Fielding, in Los Angeles, California. They would fail to discover any substantial information about Ellsberg that was to discredit him. As time passes to 1972, the presidential election year, Nixon plans to run again. However, Nixon grows worried about the election because of bad publicity with the counterculture, Vietnam War, and the Pentagon Papers. For Nixon to get an upper hand in the election, he plans to break into the Democratic National Committee building on June 17, 1972. 5 men at 2 a.m. were arrested at the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel and Office Complex, attempting to bug the building. The police investigated, and it led to suspicion why these 5 men would break into the headquarters of the Democrats. 2 reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein from the Washington Post, were interested and got involved into the burglary case. The police discovered that in one of the 5 burglars' bank accounts was a money wire transfer of $25,000 from the Republican slush campaign. This left many people to spectate John Mitchell, the Attorney General who led the fund. Mitchell denies his involvement with the burglars and resigns in the 1972 election. FBI Director Pat Gray gets involved with the Watergate burglary, knowing that the Committee for Re-election of the President and the White House, is involved with the break-in. 6 days after the break-in, Nixon asked Pat Gray to back off the case, which leads to even more controversy and suspicion about the break-in. A secret government mole, nicknamed Deep Throat, would aid Woodward and Bernstein about the burglary, helping and keeping the investigation going. Nixon would win the 1972 election by a landslide against his opponents. By 1973, Nixon would begin to fire many of his cabinet members that knew about the burglary in order to keep his cover-up. The Senate Watergate Committee would form, issuing subpoenas to certain government officials, and these testimonies would be televised on TV. June of 1973, John Dean of the White House Counsel would testify his subpoena. Dean admits discussing with Nixon about a cover-up 35 times. In addition, Alexander Butterfield, Nixon's deputy assistant, testifies to the committee about his involvement and tells about the taping system in the Oval Office. The committee was starstruck, not even knowing that there was a secret taping system in the Oval Office. The committee submits subpoenas to the tapes. More problems were piling up for Nixon. Vice President Spiro Agnew had resigned due to conspiracies about him being bribed. Leading up to the Saturday Night Massacre, Nixon fired Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor of the Watergate case. Legally, a president cannot fire the special prosecutor. Only the Attorney General has the power to do so. So Nixon orders his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox, but when he decides not to, Nixon fires Richardson. Nixon then hires William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox, but even he decides not to, so Nixon fires him. Then Nixon would get General Robert Bork to finally do the dirty work by firing Archibald Cox. Instead of turning in the tapes, Nixon decides to turn over pages of edited scripts. However, the committee demands for the tapes, which Nixon refuses to release. Nixon claims he has an executive privilege, and that is not necessary for him to release the tape. The committee would eventually take the tapes and play them, discovering that there was an 18-minute gap. The House of Representatives would pass the articles of impeachment for committing an obstruction of justice. However, Nixon, knowing that he would be impeached, decides to resign on April 9, 1974. Vice President Gerald Ford would rise and take Nixon's spot, being the 38th president. Ford gave a pardon on Nixon because he believed Nixon had already been punished enough for the scandal with public shame. After this incident known as the Watergate scandal, this led to mixed beliefs in the government. The Americans had distrust in their government, realizing how corrupt it was that even the president was involved. The Americans were lost and confused of who they could now trust. The Watergate scandal would be used to reflect many more incidents in the government, giving the country a reminder of its mistakes. Watergate would shape the American government and how it stands today.